United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, sir. We thank Madam Gilani for her briefing. As you are aware, in the capital of Kazakhstan, what just took place was the 11th international meeting under the Astana process, during which there was a discussion of matters pertaining to progression of the political settlement process on the basis of the groundwork laid down in Geneva and Sochi, of further improvements of the situation on the ground, and development of confidence-building measures among the Syrian sides. We thank the Kazakh partners for their steadfast hospitality. Following the meeting, a joint statement was adopted. The guarantor countries underscored a decisiveness to strengthen trilateral cooperation inter alia. They repudiated all attempts to create new realities on the ground under the pretext of combating terrorism, and they voiced the decisiveness to counter separatist plans, the aim of which is to undermine Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as neighboring states' national security. Iran, the Russian Federation, and Turkey welcomed the successful completion on 24 November of 2018, the completion of a pilot project to exchange forcibly held individuals. This was a step forward in building trust among the Syrian stakeholders. The situation on the whole throughout much of Syria is now stable. Despite persistent problems, there is a clear trend of improvements on the humanitarian sphere, and these are most visible in areas controlled by Damascus. It is perhaps premature to take stock of outcomes for the year, but we, for example, believe it is a great achievement that the issue of so-called blocked, besieged regions is no longer on our agenda. At the same time, we are troubled at the growing number of violations of the cessation of hostilities regime in the Idlib de-escalation zone. Last week, an especially alarming incident occurred. This was when fighters based within the area shelled residential neighborhoods in Aleppo with toxic substances, and this has already been mentioned today. There have been casualties. We trust that the OPCW will adopt timely, necessary measures in connection with the reports from Damascus. Before that, fighters affiliated with the Horasadim and illegal armed groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda mounted an attack against government troops deployed in Juzin. During this attack, 18 military personnel perished. Mr. President, Astana process guarantor states will step up efforts to ensure compliance with the cessation of hostilities regime, and they've reaffirmed a willingness to fully comply with the Memorandum on Stabilization in Idlib dating 17 September 2018. At the same time, it is important to understand that the importance of a sustained ceasefire does not remove the need to continue to effectively combat terrorism. The flow of refugees and IDPs returning to their homes is gaining traction. On average, on a daily basis, up to 1,000 people are returning from Lebanon and Jordan. The Syrian authorities, within their capacity, have been undertaking significant efforts to create favorable conditions for their citizens. Useful adjustments are being advanced at the legislative level. As we have stressed repeatedly, at this critical juncture, it is incumbent upon the international community to together help the Syrians and lend assistance to remedy the damage that has been done and to restore normal lives for people who have voluntarily decided to return to their homes. Astana process guarantor states have urged the international community, especially the UN and humanitarian agencies, to step up assistance to Syria inter alia by stepping up humanitarian deliveries and by rebuilding civilian infrastructure. For the moment, it behooves us to note that in some Western capitals have not grasped this. They continue to condition assistance on political circumstances. This is an inhumane approach. It so happens that at times others are being intimidated, others who, for example, dare to operate in circumvention of illegitimate unilateral sanctions, and this too is unacceptable. Following the eradication of the terrorist presence in southern parts of Damascus, the Syrian authorities have been developing a plan to rebuild the Palestinian Yarmouk refugee camp. Currently, the streets are being cleared. We trust that foreign donors who traditionally care about the plight of Palestinians will participate in implementation of above-mentioned plans. The situation in the healthcare sector remains difficult and serious. According to what has been drafted by the World Health Organization's country office, the Pan-Syrian Plan of Operations for 2019. According to this, there remains a need for humanitarian medical assistance, specifically in the once again liberated areas. More than half of medical institutions have either been shuttered or are only partially in operation. As a result, there is a dire scarcity of medicines which are necessary to treat the widespread disease. 1/3 of the population uses water from unreliable sources. This has all led to an outbreak over the past year of measles, leishmaniasis, and diarrhea. It is important that the World Health Organization is focusing on rebuilding the capacity of local authorities in delivering medical assistance. We consistently point to the inadmissibility of persistent unilateral sanctions targeting Syria. This significantly undermines the capacity of the authorities to gain access to medicine and medical treatment. Sir, unfortunately, there persist questions around the actions of the so-called U.S.-led coalition present on Syrian soil in breach of the core principles of international law. We are deeply troubled by the consistent ratcheting up of the U.S. military presence on the left bank of the Euphrates. According to the press, the number of U.S. military bases has now reached 19. The pace of the occupation and the gaining ground of quasi-state structures on the ground is growing, which in turn makes the prospects of a political settlement all the more remote. The military operation in Hajin in Deir ez-Zor province was called anti-ISIL, and yet it has not dealt a significant blow to the terrorists. Instead, as we heard inter alia from Madam Gilani, the victims time after time are civilians. And this is increasingly difficult to deny. The Syrian people are sending desperate letters to the Security Council, but for some reason we have not heard a significant international echo, nor have we seen a reaction to the discovery of mass graves of the victims of the coalition's airstrikes in Raqqa. Incidentally, what is flagrant are differences in statistics. The Secretary General's report refers to 1,000 unearthed bodies, whereas the letter sent to the Security Council members by the Syrian side, that is a number that is 4 times higher. According to some reports, the U.S. refuses to consider the question of payment of compensation for the dead in Raqqa. Amid this, we continue to be appalled by the details that are surfacing about some Western capitals supporting Syrian opposition armed groups. And this has morphed into weapons and other material means falling into the hands of terrorists. At the same time, the public has either been kept in the dark or deliberately misled. Those with influence to bear on the armed groups controlling certain parts in northeastern Syria, it is incumbent upon them, in our view, to persuade their protégés to address the situation regarding the fact that school children do not have access to educational institutions on government territories. And we also heard about this from Madam Gilani's report. This practice is barbaric, and there are no other words to describe it. In Damascus, incidentally, everything possible is being done to ensure reliable access to education throughout all of Syria. On the whole, it is important to acknowledge that the self-named local councils who enjoy support of external allies at times conduct discriminatory policies in the Northeast, which has led to a change in the composition of the population. The situation in Rukban camp remains exceedingly unsatisfactory. In early November, a humanitarian operation began, and this, from the organizational standpoint, was unsatisfactory. Representatives of the United Nations and the Syrian Red Crescent were denied access to the 55-kilometer zone occupied by the Americans around the Atanf zone, the base. The militants from Magarir Ahsar armed groups dealt with the distribution of assistance. Given lack of necessary oversight, a significant part of humanitarian assistance failed to reach those who needed it. Far from all of those were able to receive vaccinations insofar as they were carried out in areas far from the camp. It is difficult to trust that following such blatant errors, the Syrian government, without establishment of its authority in the part of the camp, it was difficult to believe that it will be able to easily consent to the conduct of a new humanitarian convoy. The United States bears a full responsibility for the plight of civilians in that area, and hence it is incumbent upon the United States to ensure security for the humanitarian operation in Rukban. It should not shift responsibility for implementation of this objective to the illegal armed groups. In the delivery and distribution of humanitarian assistance, it is important that UN humanitarian personnel be involved with the involvement of eminent international organizations such as the ICRC and the Syrian Red Crescent. We urgently call for the prospects to be weighed of organization of a permanent humanitarian corridor to Rukban. And on the whole, it is important to focus on a gradual dismantling of this camp with its residents being resettled. We stand ready to continue to engage in consultations with the UN, the Syrian government, with our United States and Jordanian colleagues. However, the only way to meaningfully resolve this issue is by ending the occupation around Atanf, not through one-off humanitarian initiatives. Incidentally, one of the ISIL terrorists who was taken hostage during a special operation for the liberation of Druze hostages in As-Safa to the east of Sueda, indicated that he and his affiliates and his henchmen received weapons, munitions, and food from a territory surrounding the Atanf base. It would be wise to duly get to the bottom of what is taking place in that gray zone. We are alarmed by the record low rates of wheat harvests, record lows for 30 years in Syria, and this inter alia is a consequence of the drought. Key UN bodies should lend assistance in this connection to support food security in the country, including by rebuilding the seed fund of key grains. Mr. President, there remains a great deal of uncertainty vis-à-vis cross-border deliveries of humanitarian assistance to Syria under a provisional mechanism which was introduced under UN Security Council Resolution 2165. Despite the insistence about its transparency, there is no such transparency to speak of. On Syrian soil, this has all been left to the whims of certain third parties and certain partners. And for some reason, the Security Council is shying away from indicating who they are. There has been information that some of the humanitarian assistance has been seized, and it is being stored by Jabhat al-Nusra and its satellites located in Idlib. The groups are profiting from extortion at the checkpoints along the line of separation. Local bodies sponsored by the terrorists have undertaken to seize the farmers and entrepreneurs. In the Secretary General's report, this is an issue that is touched upon in passing. There's a reference to abuses at the Bab al-Haw checkpoint, the passage point. However, this fails to reflect the scale and the scope of this manipulation with participation of Jabhat al-Nusra. According to some information, in 2015 to 2016, forces controlled in Syria in the above-mentioned period have earned and profited with up to $2 million per month. It is hard to imagine that the United Nations was unaware of the scale of this. The Secretary General conducted a review of the situation, and this has not shed light on the situation. The reality is such that the situation on the ground in Syria has significantly changed, and this is important to lead to an adjustment, a commensurate adjustment of the cross-border mechanism. Thank you for your attention.
我感谢。
I think